My apologies for starting a little bit late. This is a major drop-off in data quality after lunch. At least for my part, fortunately, Andrew is going to do some of the work, so quite a lot of the work. So the fact that my data quality has gone down will hopefully mean that on average, the data quality is as good as it was beforehand. We do tell people that averages can be misleading. Okay, so the afternoon session really is looking at the labor market work, and we've done lots of that. So this is trying to not give a full picture of everything we've done, but just highlight, as we did this morning, some of the interconnections which may not be so obvious, but also it helps actually standing back and saying, well, what has actually been done in this case over the last, well, Palms really started 10 years ago, although Andrew got hired 11 years ago. So it's 11 years. But the antecedents of that, of course, were before that in the work that that Nicola did on the OHS LFS series, and some of it goes way back before that. So what I'm going to do, and literally I've just got 2 slides on this, is, well, 3 slides. Highlight why we did that, and then some of the things that we had to solve when we wanted to look at the issue of tracking earnings over time. So that was the big question: what's happened to earnings since the end of apartheid? Once you sort of try and take account of as many of the data glitches along the way as we can. And implicit in that, of course, is what's happened to inequality. You know, how does the middle of the distribution compared to what's happened at the top and the bottom? The question of why, of course, is also floating in the background, although that is more speculative, and I don't think that we have real answers to that. The question, how sure are we of the data, is one that I do want you to bear in mind, because effectively we think we've done a good job, so we're reasonably sure about some of the things we give, but we do believe in healthy skepticism also, you know. So basically we don't want to become complete cynics that we can't know anything about everything, but it's always good to take the stuff with just a tiny pinch of salt. So on the left-hand side, I'm just going through some of the big questions that underpinned the Palms earnings series. So the first issue which we addressed this morning is that the sampling weights, at least initially, didn't give a coherent series. You know, so we spoke about this morning, about how we crack that. Then the more specific earnings-related questions is that in a lot of the surveys, there are considerable numbers of people who report in brackets, and there are at least some people where the information is completely missing. So we had to deal with that, and it turns that whichever way you cut it, it's very clear that the people who are missing, whether it's because they're giving only brackets or because they refuse to answer outright, that they're different from the people that we're getting the actual round amounts, and how you correct for that matters. So there's an initial set of fixes released with Palms, what we call bracket weights, which deal with the bracket issues, and then we ultimately issued also a set of multiply imputed earnings to deal with the completely missings. When I say in that cryptic note on the slides, there are different ways of dealing with these, not equally good, there are also midpoint approaches. There are other imputation approaches, which, well, they're probably not as bad as not dealing with it at all, but they're pretty terrible, kind of like, so we basically believe that trying to do this thing right is better than trying to get a sort of mediocre approximation. The third issue, which turns out to have an interesting corollary, which I'll talk to a little bit later, if I get my slides right, is that extreme values bite you. So basically, it turns out that, and this goes in certain surveys, that in some surveys we're just picking up too many millionaires, as it were. And the suspicion is that at least some, well, quite a lot of them are bogus millionaires, which just got recoded incorrectly. There's a decimal point missing. So effectively, if you get 2 extra zeros onto your monthly amount, then then you suddenly start looking very healthy indeed. So that's one reason why there may be bogus millionaires in there. The other reason is just that some people think it's funny to tell interviewers, ha ha ha, I earned kind of like 2 million, and if the interviewer doesn't take the joke and puts it down, well, that's what you get. So in PALMS, we have these corrections. We spent a lot of time on that. And then what you can do, which is the right panel, is you can start thinking, well, what does that do to the actual, to the earnings over time? And this is a graph that I think people by now would have seen often, although sometimes people say stuff which suggests that they didn't actually see it properly, which is really that the 90th percentile, which is the dark blue line in the left-hand graph, when compared to the median, shot up between 94 and 2012. So being initially at about 2.5 times the value of the middle earner, as it were, by the end it's more like 5 times the amount. So basically we have this increase at the top. That's also true for the 75th percentile, which is not, that's not right at the top. That's, kind of more like in the middle of the distribution. We'd often think of that, but that's also pulled away from the median in a way which suggests that we have this fanning out of inequality at the top end. And then at the bottom, it looks the other way around, that basically the 10th percentile, so these are the worst earners, in fact, seem to have moved up towards the median, at least by 2012, and not much action around the 25th percentile. So different behavior at the bottom of the distribution, the top. So this was written up in an SAJE set of papers. But even with all of these corrections, even with the best fiddling, there are other changes that happened over this period, which are much harder to deal with. So basically, there's a break between the OHS and LFSs. So the LFSs really don't enable you to give both self-employed and wage income. So it's unclear if you're now only reporting your main source of income, what does that do to overall wage inequality? And then in an exercise that I was commissioned to do for the ILO, I was asked to compare the QLFS earnings to the earnings that come off the firm surveys in the QES, and it turned out that there's a big discrepancy, and a discrepancy which persists. Yeah, I mean, so it's there basically all the way through, and it's part of that broader mismatch we talked about between household level surveys and surveys which come at things more from the establishment side. So in 2011, the QLFS median wage was 3,000 Rand per month. The QS average wage, which is of course not a median, is 12,000. And I spent a lot of effort trying to work out where's the mismatch coming from. So the gap of about 9,000 Rand, of course, is partially driven by the fact that the mean wage in all of these labor force surveys lies considerably above that of the median. So about 36% of the gap in Q1, 42% in Q2. So somewhere in the high 30s of the gap is just the mean versus the median. But that doesn't get you up to 9,000. So coverage is a bit different. So the QS firms obviously exclude agriculture and whatever. It turns out that coverage differences make some difference in the gap, but not much. The suspicion is that we have, well, we know that the firm surveys don't do well at the bottom. So, so maybe small firms dilute the thing, doesn't make much of a difference. Part-time workers, I didn't think that was a plausible part of the story. Missing high earners, so basically we know that they're missing in these surveys. There will be in the QES. Accounting for that, basically we get 3% of the gap. So I came to the conclusion that the biggest gap just had to be underreporting of earnings in the QLFS. So basically that was a guesstimate coming off the mine sector, where basically we have very good coverage. We know what mine workers do earn, and if we look at what they get reported in the QLFS, well, so maybe there's a 30%, maybe upwards of that, underreporting in the QLFS, and on the other hand, maybe the QS is underreport to the number of people working for them. Maybe they've got people that they don't sort of formally put on the books. Even once you make all of these allowances, there's still a 15%, probably more like a 20% unexplained gap. And that we need to bear in mind when we're dealing with the data, is that, yeah, that certainly, and there's other evidence I'll show a little bit later on, which talks about the underreporting of earnings, that we're getting a very partial view when we look at the surveys. Andrew is going to talk. This thing's gone dead. Is that? Thanks.
Okay. Hi again. Palms had its own birthday celebration earlier this year, so that's why you've not been hearing much directly about Palms. But just to say that, underlying the work that Martin's presented and the work that I'm going to be talking about is 10 years worth of work on Palms and trying to figure out these things, with Martin providing the intellectual vision and me doing most of the grunt work, except on earnings, where Martin spent a lot of time, not just in that ILO paper, but in a bunch of other work, really giving us a good method of trying to make the different surveys earnings as comparable as possible. So this is definitely building on all of that work over a long period of time. So one of the things that was required for PALMS is that there were these very big differences in the questions within the OHS on labor earnings, and then also between the OHS and the LFS. And so the questions changed, and there were a bunch of other things also, so it made it more difficult. And in contrast, the QLFS questions have pretty much been identical since 2010. But the problem is that StatsSA has imputed for refusals and don't knows in a variety of ways, and there's very little documentation of those methods in the public domain. So for those of you who've spent any time talking to me or attending any other seminars, you'll know that this is my stuck record that I keep repeating. So I guess bear with me, gonna repeat it again today, but hopefully show you a few more new and interesting things. I think one of the strange things is that, so I arrived in 2011, the QLFS had already been collected for 1 year, started working in PALMS, and probably by 2013, maybe 2012 even, there was QLFS earnings. So I've been sitting staring at this data in Stata for 10 years. And not full time, but you know, and yet it's taken a very long time to try and realize things have only kind of been clarified or more clarified in the last few years. So I guess it's, I don't know, I look back on that and think, why did that happen? How was it that it took so long to try and figure these things out? Maybe I was just very slow, or I don't know, maybe I didn't spend enough time staring at PALMS and Stata. Maybe I should have been doing that full time. Anyway, so I'm going to be saying some things about earnings imputation. And one of the reasons is because we had a nice, fruitful interaction with someone at StatsSA who gave us unimputed 2011 data, and in a few different papers now, Martin and I have used that to show how things, some of the problems. The difficulty is that 2011 is a long time ago, and the imputation method has changed at least twice since then. So we're sort of doing the best we can. The ideal would be, please StatsSA release publicly earnings data that's unimputed. So I don't know who's on the call, but if StatsSA is out there, this is my plea to you to make that data publicly available and to tell us how, in fact, you do impute the data. So two graphs that you've probably seen at some point already, or one graph and one table. This is showing on the left-hand side the Gini coefficient for earnings for a bunch of different surveys. So the ones from PALMS are the blue, the OHS, the LFS, which is in red, and the QLFS, which is in green. And you can see a very strange trend from 2010 onwards in the Gini coefficient. Impossible trend. There's no ways that the Gini can be bouncing around that much, and that's taking care of outliers and other kinds of problems that we think might be present in the data. And so to my mind, this is evidence that something strange is going on with earnings. And one of the things which got suggested to, I don't know, me and Martin, I don't know if it was Callie or Murray or something, why don't you just do PALMS for the OHS and the GHS? It turned out that that is, you know, a very full-time job, and I already had one other job. So I wasn't going to be doing that, but I've subsequently put some of the GHSs together, and that's the sort of gray line over here. And it does bounce around a little bit, but certainly much less than earnings inequality in the QLFS. So what happened to earnings inequality over the full period? I asked my students this 2 weeks ago, and they said that obviously earnings inequality went up because of the green right there at the end. And I guess, yeah, I don't think that's true, but it's hard to know what actually happened without some better data. And then this is just one little table from our paper on union wage premia. We also got a little bit of data for 2012 as well, but you can see this is the coefficients on the union dummy and a log wage regression with a bunch of other controls. And there's very substantial attenuation going on. So that's very common, that's normal in cases where you have imputation, and the imputation doesn't respect the underlying process. So for example, you don't use trade union membership in a hot deck imputation, or you don't even use it in a regression imputation, you're going to get attenuation of the union coefficient. So union members, you know, how much more do they earn than non-union members, controlling for a bunch of other stuff? Well, you're going to get very wrong answer if you use the imputed data. This is another one also from that paper, looking at the variance of log earnings across different groups of people, union, non-union, union public, etc. On the left-hand side, looks a little bit nicer because over here there's actually no data from 2008 so that's not obvious if it's in the box there. But what you can see is kind of a consistent pattern, and alternatively you can see the crazy stuff that's going on here when you use the regular imputed data in the QLFS. So, you know, patterns that were stable, you know, you start mixing and matching the earnings of union members and non-union members, or the public sector and non-public sector, well, then you're just going to kind of make these sectors look much less different than they actually are. So that's another hint that something has gone wrong. Yeah, okay. So we made some progress and have made some progress. I think the first time we put this in the public domain was a 2017 working paper, some of the stuff. And it was only in PALMS 3.3 that we actually put in a warning that said this data is bad enough that you shouldn't be using it, or you should be very, very careful for what you use it for. So perhaps that was a bit late. We could have done that a little bit earlier. We certainly mentioned that there was imputation going on in the data, but we didn't say how bad it was until 2019, which is now 3 years ago. So to make some more progress, one thing that helped was that in 2021, Sihle Kanyile, who may be on the Zoom call, he's now doing a master's at Michigan. He was a student in the postgraduate diploma and a former Stats South Africa employee. He managed to get access to non-public 2017 QLFS earnings data, and he did some comparisons to the public data. And his paper, in a descriptive way, showed that the earnings imputations don't look good. So it turns out that in the public data, you either have an amount up until 2019, you have an amount. Andrew earns 5,000 Rand a month, or you have refusals. So those are the only two options, either an amount of money or a refusal. But when Sihle went and looked at this, it turns out that it's not just Andrew's getting, he doesn't report his earnings and he gets an imputation of 10,000. It's sometimes that what's in the public data is a refusal is actually a bracket. So someone reported, I earn between 2,500 and 3,500 Rand a month. And if you look in the public data, that's classified as a refusal. And that's even worse. So we didn't know how bad it was. And that's turned out that Sihle showed us that that was even worse than we thought in 2017. So if you go and open any of the labor market dynamics up until not including 2020, you'll see only earnings amounts and refusals. But it turns out that those refusals are a mixture of brackets, refusals, and don't knows. And I'll show you a bit more from my own work. Okay, so this is 2020, where it looks like things changed again, maybe because of COVID, maybe because of lower sample, lower response rates, I don't know. So this is what's in the public data. As I said, there's you can't distinguish between bracket amounts, bracket responses or amounts. So there's just amounts. And that's about 80% have either a bracket or amount, except in Q3 where it's 50. And then you can see there's 17% refusals, and then it goes to 0, and then there's a whole lot of don't knows, lots of don't knows and refusals, and then again, almost no don't knows and refusals. So if you took out the labor market dynamics data set from Data First or from Stats SA, that's what you'd see across these 4 quarters. And that's just unbelievable. So something has gone wrong even worse in 2020. And I managed to get some unimputed data for 2020 from another organization that requested it from Stats SA, and they passed it along to me. They didn't have any sharing conditions on that data. So it wasn't like they were doing anything wrong. And it does seem that Stats SA is somewhat willing to give out earnings data if you ask nicely or you ask often. That's what we haven't asked often enough and nicely enough, I'm not sure. Anyway, this data looks much, much more sensible. So the amounts, you can distinguish between amounts, brackets, don't knows, and refusals. And even though they changed to a telephone survey in Q2, you can still see that the amounts are stable, sensible, and the brackets are similar, and refusals and don't knows are similar. So that's kind of shocking that you can get table 1 in the public data and table 2 in the unimputed data. So that's a very bad place to be in. And just to point out, because we haven't had unimputed data for so long, it's been hard to figure out how many item non-responses or what fraction of the sample has item non-response. So if you consider the bracket and amount to be some kind of a response, this is now approaching 30%. The don't knows and refusals are 30%. So that's kind of a problem. There's a lot of people who are just not giving any information at all. And you wouldn't necessarily see that in the public data where, well, except for Q3 where something strange is going on there. So this is a version of what CK did, but a little bit different. The unimputed data, I should say one thing. When I check the amounts, you have to convert like daily, weekly, monthly, annual amounts into a month. For people who do report an amount in the public and in the unimputed non-public data, the amounts that I created are almost exactly like what Stats SA created. So for 50% of the sample, things look fine. It's the bracket don't know refusal people in the unimputed data, the true brackets, true don't knows, and true refusals where things start to go wrong. So the first is, let's look at what happens to the bracket people. That's the first row. So of everyone who reports a bracket in 2020, 8% go into the correct bracket. Okay, so if you say between 2.5 and 3,500 Rand a month, of all the people who said that, and the same for all the other brackets, overall across all the brackets, 8% of people are reporting in the get a rand amount in the public data that falls in that bracket. Okay, so and then the very strange thing is that a large fraction of people who actually reported brackets, this is kind of what Cecilia showed also.
Sorry,
Yeah.
oh,
Oh, okay. So I just okay.
You can walk around.
Okay. I don't know which of those is going to be more useful. I don't want to put 2 mics together. Is that going to be a problem?
I think the problem is just when you move away from the
Yeah.
people on the call will not.
Missing out the crucial stuff about the QLFS. Yes. Okay. So first row, very small fraction of people in the correct bracket, and a very large and strange percentage of people, even though they said I earn between 2.5 and 3,500 Rand a month, are nevertheless in the public data shown as don't know or refusal. And then half of the people are in the incorrect bracket. And it's similar for, or not quite as bad for don't knows and refusals. There's a bunch of people who report don't know in the unimputed data who get a don't know, but there are also some who end up with a refusal. And then these people are actually imputed, the 55% are given an imputed amount, which that would make sense. We'd expect that some of the don't knows the Stats SA is imputing, they'd get an amount. But the crazy thing is that some people get a don't know and even well, that's not crazy either, but then there's this mixture of some people get imputed, others don't, and some people get a refusal. And the story for refusals is similar. So this is very worrying. I've only last week, though, sent an email to StatsSA with some of these tables in, so I'm hoping that I'll get a response. And yeah, I guess another health warning from me, if you haven't heard of one already, that using the QLFS earnings data is not great. I don't have permission to publicly share the data, but I also didn't have any conditions on the data that I got from the other organization. You got it from StatsSA, so I don't know. If you want the data, maybe you can come talk to me. The ideal situation, though, is Martin and I are not in the business, as you will have seen throughout today, of putting, of getting, for the most part, getting data that isn't publicly available. We've been doing public good type work, and so we don't want this data for ourselves. We want StatsSA to make it publicly available for everyone. So just two examples. Martin doesn't like some forms of imputation. Well, I did a very simple wage, just a regression imputation for the don't knows and refusals in the unimputed data. And that's when you do that and compare to the StatsSA data where there is information on earnings, you underestimate the number of people earning the minimum wage by almost 2 million people. So that's massive, huge. I mean, it's gigantic. So there's, it's not just that the numbers are kind of jumbled up and that you can't figure out that someone's earning more in the public sector or in the union. It's that everyone's earnings are on average way too low. So that's a big problem. And then just if you do a simple earnings regression, you can explain 30% of the variation in log earnings in the public data and 60% using the unimputed data. So that's like another example. This is all just jumbled up and unhelpful. And again, you get a very attenuated union wage coefficient. Okay, so that's the crazy news on QLFS earnings. And then a little known project, in addition to PALMS, is ESES. I actually called it ESES, Employers and Self-Employed Series. And that was something that came out of PALMS. The idea was to put together some surveys from something that Stats South Africa did, the survey of employers and self-employed. So self-employed people have been measured in all the surveys since 1993, the PSLSD, OHS, etc. But there's been lots of changes in questionnaires, definitions, rules, etc. So this is from a older paper by Martin and myself, showing trends in different types of employment. And we've got self-employment, non-VAT registered, domestic work, subsistence agriculture, informal self-employment, informal wage employment. So I guess there's two things that are important here. The first is that there's almost no subsistence agriculture until the LFSs. Then there's a spike to 1.5 million, and it drops down very dramatically. And then there's almost none. And then in 2008, StatsSA said, we're not counting subsistence agriculture as work anymore. So that's gone to 0. And a very strange spike in 2001 in the number of non-VAT registered self-employment. So that's not all self-employment, like there's domestic work there, but there are some very strange changes over time. And some of this is about definitions and what's counted as work. So this survey of employers and self-employed has been done every 4 years, and it's partly to measure the size of GDP in the non-VAT registered sector. So StatsSA has enterprise surveys, those get used to measure GDP, but StatsSA from 2001 onwards has tried to get a sense of how much activity has been going on when it tries to estimate GDP, how much activity there is in the informal sector. So the survey piggybacks on the LFS and QLFS, and if you report being an owner of a non-VAT registered business, then you get re-interviewed. And so this series, which seems like people don't actually know about, it only goes up to 2013. I haven't put in the 2017 one. It's a similar idea to Palms. Pies came from Palms, and now this S has also come out of Palms, and that was funded by Ready and so the National Treasury. So again, example number 2, you heard me on OHSs. This is a nice example showing that fieldwork matters. How it worked in 2001 was the very first, this massive spike over here exactly coincides with that survey. The spike is in 2001 for those on Zoom who can't see me or me pointing at the slides. What happened is that the field workers were asked to do a separate survey with everyone who had a non-VAT registered business, and they were paid per interview that they had, extra interview that they had to do. So it was more time, you got to go and re-interview people. So then you have to pay them, and people were paid at that point were on contracts being paid by Survey Stats SA, didn't have permanent field staff, which they now do. And so unexpectedly, if you pay people to find the self-employed, then you're going to find lots more self-employed than you otherwise would. So that's what happened in that survey. This is not news. Stats South Africa said this in a public presentation that Martin and I once went to. Somebody said, yes, people were, making up, someone who was a field worker said, yes, people were making up data left and right as I was doing my job diligently. So if you take this as true and you start in 2001, well, self-employment has collapsed. And the same is true if you just take those 4S surveys and do the same thing, you'll find that it's collapsed, and that just isn't true. There's a World Bank report that says that agricultural employment has also collapsed, and that's because they didn't realize that there's no more subsistence agriculture, and that was not an important part of all agriculture. So yeah, these kind of definitions, field work, that all matters. So OHS 99 was the first time that small households were properly enumerated. There was a lot more employment there. The first LFS had massive amounts of subsistence agriculture, and so did the second. So those red spikes over there. And then in the third LFS, there was the SESI survey with a massive spike in the amount of self-employment. But basically these surveys, 4 of them, made it look like there was this massive increase in employment around that time. That was partly an artifact of strange things, and by bad luck, they all happened to be, I don't know, good luck, I'm not sure what that was. They all happened to be in exactly the same 4 surveys. So that's kind of interesting for a variety of reasons, sampling, fieldwork changes, and I don't know, some push by someone maybe to find lots more employment in subsistence agriculture. That one we don't know as much about. We had this very strange spike in employment for the first 99, 2000 and the first half of 2001. So yeah, I guess it's an illustration of the kinds of data quality issues that matter. Yeah. And I think this is going to be my presentation for later in the afternoon. So I'm going to stop there. Hand over to Martin.
Okay, so these are the slides that we've been through. Okay, so this is what I'm going to be talking about. And as I said, there's a flip side to the outlier story, which I'm about to talk about. So this incidentally is in a ready working paper, 2017. It's not out in the journals because basically I got distracted, which I think is the story of my life. Yeah, so the story is high incomes matter a lot for inequality. We know that. They're also interesting. So a lot of us focus on poverty, which is the left tail, but the rich are actually as interesting, and they are generally, we know, underrepresented in the surveys. So when you get an extreme value, an outlier, you have to work out, is this a real value or is this not? And part of the way in which we distinguish those in palms is basically you run a earnings regression, and if it had too big a residual, then we said, well, the explanatory variables we see about you don't seem right. You're probably a bogus person. But that's kind of like, I guess, an assumption. So Carl and Fleischer have a general argument which says that basically these surveys undercapture the rich, and maybe what you really need to do is kind of almost ignore the top tail that you see in the empirical data and splice what you think happens in the tail in parametrically. So, and concretely what they suggest is you should estimate a Pareto distribution, take the Pareto coefficient, and that then gives you a measure of, you know, how many rich there should be. And in fact, you can do better than that. You can actually then correct any of your inequality measures by allocating whatever part of inequality comes from the top tail. So the Pareto distribution is interesting for that. So I've been toying around with Pareto distributions for a long time. But of course, now one of the things that you have to confront is that if you're aggressively cleaning out what you think may be bogus extreme values, your ability to estimate that coefficient accurately is actually a function of what you did beforehand. You know, so basically, so you have to have a procedure that cleans out the extreme values that is consistent with what you think happens there. And one of the things, if you do what we did on palms with the wage regressions, is that you're using a log normal distribution to say, well, what's extreme? You're actually going to pick fewer extreme values up there than you do with the Pareto. So that didn't seem right anymore. So I was thinking, like, you know, so basically we need a way of estimating the Pareto distribution and cleaning out these extreme values at the same time. That is harder also given the fact that you've got so few observations to start off with in these things. So you're actually doing an estimation on fairly sparse data. And of course, the fact that a lot of them are completely missing. So basically, so you've got a sort of interesting set of problems that bite each other. So so I'd basically developed my own routine for estimating outliers and estimating the Pareto next to each other in a way that tried to make them compatible with each other. And I'm not going to go through the technique. Intuitively, where that comes from is that one way of thinking about a Pareto distribution is that when you graph it out, you should get approximately a straight line. So what we have on the x-axis is the earnings in logs. And then we graph what fraction of the sample, what's actually the population, once you use the weights on there, that earns that amount or more. So obviously, as we go along, that fraction drops. You know, there are fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer people left in the rich. But if that distribution is Pareto, it should be approximately straight line. Things that deviate, so shoot off left and right, and you can see a couple at the bottom, they are basically a sign, you know, that they're probably not consistent with the estimate you would get from the rest of the distribution. So that's intuitively what you're doing, is you're trying to estimate a Pareto parameter which kind of like respects what most of the observations are doing, while still keeping an eye on, you know, what else there is still to come. Now, it turns out that if you compare, so take that graph and you basically strip out outliers with the Palms procedure, you're basically lopping off the tail very merrily at the top. You know, you can see like my procedure is more conservative. It ends up treating a lot more of what we thought were outliers as, well, these are potentially observations that are actually consistent with the distribution that comes before it. But it raises some other issues. I mean, so if you look at these graphs here, that OHS 99 is kind of like, sort of like is a flatter graph than the others, which basically means effectively there's more inequality in there for much longer. There are many more rich all the way through. And there's clearly some shifts up and down in that Pareto coefficient. So we can actually see, well, what does the sort of parametric estimates suggest when we take that across Palms. And so here we have on the x-axis the estimated Pareto coefficient, which is a sort of inverse measure of inequality. The lower that Pareto coefficient, the more there is in that top tail. The higher that Pareto coefficient, you know, the fewer rich people effectively there are. And what is kind of striking is that, I mean, we already knew there was a shift between the OHSs and the LFSs, but if you were to believe the Pareto coefficients, we've gone from pretty much the maximal level of, you know, rich people in the OHS 99, so lots and lots and lots of people in that top tail, to the LFS, where basically there's nobody up there, you know. So we know that the LFS had a lot more people at the bottom of the tail coming in, so a lot more of the poor people kind of get measured with sort of marginal sets of attachments to the labor force, but the top end is missing. And in fact, the poor matter nothing at all for this, because they're not part of these calculations. So yeah, so the problem of OHS 99 is not just a problem of like a handful, 12 millionaires, which is what you can see in the data. There's actually like somehow the whole tail is pushed right up, and why that happens, we don't know. The February 2000 LFS is basically seems to miss that top completely. So you have this complete sort of like, you know, sort of mad switch between these two surveys, which took place actually within a couple of months of each other. So that break in some sense is deeper than we even thought. The other thing just to note is that any coefficient of Pareto coefficient above 2, and there are quite a lot there, and quite a lot hovering around 2, that's the sort of cutoff for where something's classified as a fat tail distribution. If you take the 1.8, which is the kind of average over all of the data sets we see, it means that, you know, there are a lot of rich people, which we kind of knew about South Africa, and taking them into consideration is probably important, and they're probably not there in sufficient numbers in the actual survey. So that's the earning stuff. I think let's take questions on this. Diana. Mike.
Oh, sorry about that. So I was saying I have a few questions. One of the questions is what happens in a survey when you don't see any missing at all among a certain category? So let's say in my data, we define work as anyone who is either an apprentice, self-employed divided into two, working employer or on account worker. And then you have the paid employee category. But now under paid employee in one of the surveys, there's absolutely no missing data. But the zeros are also not like too many for you to feel like that these people were actually put in the zero categories. Like if you look at the other surveys, the 0, the 2%, the ones who are reporting the zeros is just within the ballparks of the other survey. But now we're having a survey where there's absolutely no missing value. Now, when you try to plot a spike plot, you can't quite see a spike other than the zeros. So is it true that there was absolutely no missing? Because now it's very confusing. That's one. The next one, what happens when in a survey you are worried that there's no high income earner at all? For instance, if you look at the highest value is perhaps $2,000 a month, and I know that's not possible. Of course, we have people and we know that they earn much more than that, given that, of course, I'm from Kenya. So I know for sure 2,000 cannot be what you call the rich people who earn $2,000. So you can't quite impute and do operator because in the first place, you're not having these people. And then finally, the final question is, now when you're doing your earnings over time, you definitely need to have the earnings data. So there are categories that we can easily exclude, but then there are categories that we know they have earnings data. It's just that you can't include them, like on account workers in Kenya, because agriculture is a main sector. It means that even if you try to include them, you're going to end up with lots of missings and zero, because the way the question is asked is, what did you earn last month? And if you've not yet earned that money, what are you expecting to earn? So, but for these people, it's not like they're paid on a monthly basis. So how then do you deal with the fact that you have to exclude this self-employed and agriculture? And like for Kenya, it's a big deal because agriculture employs about 40%. Yeah, thanks.
Lots of questions. I don't think that any of them have easy answers. Andrew, do you want to kind of take a stab? So, I mean, okay, so let's give the one which is, if there are no missings and it's, you know, there are quite a lot of people and you expect some people to refuse, then you should smell a rat. I mean, so basically somebody is post-processed the data and they're not telling you that, you know, so basically, so it's a little bit like if we'd never had the earlier series and we'd only ever seen the QLFS where everything is imputed, you know, you'd look at the patterns, you think there's some strange things, but you wouldn't actually smell a rat. You'd just say, well, actually, okay, that's the data. We know that basically because of the LFS, that there are lots of people who don't want to answer this thing. They've been there in every survey. If they suddenly disappear, well, you know that there's something there. And if the stats agency doesn't want to tell you what it did, well, there's not actually much you can do. I mean, that's the bottom line, you know. So basically, so we're sitting now with the data. You're trying to work out, is there some way that we can kind of post hoc separate what is real data from what's false data? And the reality is you can't actually, you know. I mean, so you actually need, as Andrew got the unimputed data, and you suddenly see, well, yes, there are lots of missings that there were, and this is what's happened to them. So no, if the data producer doesn't tell you how they're imputed, you unfortunately are sunk. You have to believe their data or whatever. On the things, what to do about the missing high-income people, I mean, that is the fundamental problem of doing socioeconomic research, is that we have the people that we report on have an interest in how they're perceived, kind of like if they don't want to tell us something, they're not going to tell us. And even the best fieldwork company in the world may not change that, kind of like, so yeah, I mean, so my anecdote from the little field, I don't generally do field work. I did some testing out in the Agincourt area on a survey that Anne Case was running. So that was a lot of my anecdotes come from the rural area. We were talking to the local moneylender. Just, I don't know, this wasn't deliberate. He ended up in the test sample. This was before the thing went to field. I was part of the testing. And he was actually at work because he got a steady income on a malaria eradication project from the health ministry. And we were talking to his wife and his mother. And somebody clearly sent an SMS to him. Well, no, this was pre-SMS days, smoke signal, that there were foreigners talking to his family. He was there within kind of like 30 minutes to check out what we were doing. And we got none of the, I mean, everybody in the village knew he was the money lender, the Mashonisa. We got the money that he got through the malaria eradication project, but we got no profits out of him whatsoever. He wasn't even admitting to us that he was lending money, kind of like, and I understand why. I mean, basically, this is a small community. If you kind of say, well, actually, I'm making, sort of like, so back then he was earning 1,000 Rand a month. That everybody knew because that was a standard rate that people doing that kind of job would get. But he was probably making kind of like, sort of like, he was making thousands on top of that. And we could see it. Like you look in the yard, there was building materials stacked, as he was doing all his alterations. But they said, no, we're very poor. We're only earning $1,000. And I said, you're basically lying to me, but I'm going to write it down because you can't tell somebody to their face when you're interviewing them, you must be lying to me. That's kind of just doesn't. So yes, you've got a problem because if the rich people don't want to own up to them, how much they're earning, you're not going to get it. Sophia.
Thank you. I have a question for Andrew. Stats SA underestimating those earning minimum wage by 1.8 million is not trivial. So I'm sure you know that. My question is, who's doing the data capturing at Stats SA to that table you showed with the public data, with the don't knows and refusals? That high proportion is extremely concerning. And then if you're looking at measuring the top end of the distribution, what do you do if you only have brackets? So the brackets put a cap. Well, they don't put a cap. It's open-ended. It's like whatever, 30,000 a month or more, but that could be much more. So there's actually no way of being able to backward induce without making it up how high the income is of the people at the top, why don't we just have a survey for rich people where someone just drives around Bishop's Court asking rich people how much they earn?
It's called Stats, SARS. SARS does a survey of rich people. So no, I mean, if you want that, I think that you're not. Yeah. So I mean, once you get into that range, they're not going to tell any survey organization anything because it's the underlying trust issue. Kind of like you can tell them as much as you like that the stuff is going to be kept confidential. But if you Marcus Juster, do you really believe somebody that they're not going to? And he was honest to you and gave you his full set of accounts. No, of course not. There was Taryn had her hand up.
Can I answer?
Yeah.
if someone from Stats SA is on the Zoom call, I'd be very happy for them to give a response. So I don't know, Jackie, if you're getting any Stats SA people saying anything, but if you get any hands, let us know. So, I mean, labor statistics in Stats SA is the people that are doing those imputations. So yeah, I don't want, I mean, I talk to those people occasionally, but so I don't want to speak on their behalf other than to say that there's a specific, the people who run the QLFS also in charge of doing the imputations. So they got to tell us what's going on there. I'm not going to speak on their behalf or even try to, guess at what's going on. What happens if you only got brackets for the very top people? Yeah, then you're in trouble. I guess you got to potentially use another survey. And if you want to guess at their amount, Charles Simpkins told Martin, who told me that maybe you should double the amount of money.
That comes off the Pareto thing. So in fact, the coefficient of 1.8 actually suggests that it's actually going to be a little bit more than double than what you should be doing. But that's a first cut approximation. No, look, I mean, I think that you can actually use estimate Pareto distributions off bracket data. You can. And then at least if you're willing to believe that parametric representation, then you can get a sense of how many rich people there are and how stretched that distribution ought to be. So I mean, it's not going to tell you, you can't estimate the max off that because that's, yeah.
Martin, so just to follow up on your comment about SARS, like have people, would you be able to, in theory, look at the tax data and look at the shape of the tail at that part of the distribution and sort of benchmark against your measure?
I've got some stuff later on 2011 tax data. Okay. But the reality is that basically the tax data, they're not going to give you the stuff on the 100 richest people in South Africa anyhow, because, yeah, I mean, you'd be able to work out who they are. So basically, so you'd need somebody in SARS to kind of, if you have a particular research question, which literally you wanted to do on the top 10, you'd have to ask them. And of course, they're going to lie to SARS. I mean, so basically, or at least it's not called lying, it's called tax management, kind of like, but I mean, yes, it's the same principle. But that happens right around the world. I mean, that's kind of like, so that's why Piketty kind of like, they do, worry about the rich, but they also realize that, that's a problem that everybody runs into. And the local gang bosses, they're not even going to be in SARS, probably kind of like, and they're going to be some multimillionaires there.